G'day, ZiggyD here with another Path of Exile guide. Today I want to share a guide to my incredibly powerful Reach of the Council Tornado Shot Assassin, otherwise known as the AssReacher. With this build I set out to make a puncture build using Reach of the Council and Assassin's powerful bleed and poison nodes, you know, the ones that double your bleed and poison damage. However, through testing I found that Tornado Shot was more powerful than puncture in this build in every way possible. Incredible single target, insanely good AoE clear, good sustain and defensive bonuses, and Tornado Shot is even better at applying bleeds and poisons than puncture is. With Reach of the Council's additional arrows and the Labyrinth enchants for extra secondary projectiles, Tornado Shot is a top tier skill, possibly even better than Lightning Arrow. This build has been tested and proven not only viable, but incredible in some of the game's most challenging content. It melts Atziri and Uber Izaro in the endgame labyrinth, and it makes tier 15 bosses look like tier 1 bosses. Without a doubt, this is the strongest build I've ever made. I'm really quite pleased with it. Whatever you want to do, tier 15 maps, Uber Izaro or Atziri, this build has you covered. So I'll explain a bit about how this build works, and then I'll explain how you can get it up and running for yourself. I made and optimized this build for softcore leagues, sacrificing some life for damage, but we are not without survivability. The insane damage we get from physicals scaled with bleed and poison means that we can use defensive buffs like Grace and Arctic Armor without even noticing the damage loss. Stacking these with dodge from acrobatics and Hinakora's sight, and the powerful new evasion chest Kintsugi means we can survive most things that live long enough to attack us. However, it's actually rare that anything stays alive long enough to pose a threat, given that our Tornado Shot unleashes a nova of 30 projectiles in 2 screens radius around us. Most things are crit, poisoned, bleeding, maimed, knocked back, and dead before they can react. So, how do we get such huge damage without using things like Hatred, Herald of Ash, and Taste of Hate? Well, we start with the solid physical damage of Reach of the Council. This bow is incredible because it gives you greater multiple projectiles without the damage penalty, and allows you to use an actual damage gem in its place, providing you with the rough equivalent of a 7.5 link on a 6 linked bow. From there we scale crit, physical and projectile damage, and then Assassin feeds us power charges that makes those charges even more impactful with unstable and deadly infusion nodes. From there we use that high base physical damage to apply bleeds and poisons with Noxious Strike. We also support poison with Fatal Toxins and Dirty Techniques passive clusters. As Tornado Shot can hit each enemy multiple times, we very quickly gain all of the benefits of Noxious Strike, including Maim, which slows down enemies. From there we further scale up our damage with Toxic Delivery, which gives us added chaos damage against bleeding enemies, and then most significantly 100% more poison damage from crits and 100% more bleed damage on maimed enemies. Coupled with the more projectile damage from PHYS and slower projectiles and then vulnerability, this means absolutely ridiculous amounts of damage over time, in addition to strong initial hits. For the record, in this build vulnerability curse triple dips on bleed, thanks to scaling the physical damage twice and damage over time on top of that. And then it double dips on poison, scaling the initial hit and then the poison damage. I just can't even begin to state how much degen damage this actually is, but it should be pretty evident from the background footage. Check out how quickly it melts tier 15 Calm with extra boss life. So now let's take a look at the gear I'm currently running, the endgame optimized setup, and I'll also explain how you can get up and running on a budget as well. Prices mentioned in this section are in Prophecy Softcore at the time of recording. The first thing for this build is of course the Reach of the Council bow. This thing is incredible, and as a result it's currently not very cheap, at around 3 exalts minimum. You can do this build the same with a regular PHYS crit bow, but it'll have to be pretty damn good to offset the need to use greater multiple projectiles and the damage loss that entails from that. However, you don't need Reach of the Council to get started with this build. Death's Opus, the new fated unique upgrade to Death's Harp, can be bought for less than 5 chaos, and this bow is strong enough that you can use it to both level and at early endgame to start farming currency for your Reach. I've tested it in tier 9 and 10 maps and it works pretty damn well. You can also use Lionized Glare, this costs less than 3 chaos. Both of these extremely cheap options are effective well into mid-tier maps, far enough to make the currency you need to save up for Reach of the Council. The quiver for this build is of course the Drill Neck. With stacking PHYS chance, this gives 100% increased projectile damage, a stat that double dips. That is, that it scales our initial hit and our damage over time as well. Your long-term goal is to do as I did and get a corrupted one with 1 additional arrow. This is a huge boost to clear speed and to single target damage. The helmet is another key slot. As soon as possible you want to get a helmet with +1 Tornado Shot projectiles, and later one with +2 Tornado Shot projectiles. For the latter you'll need to spend a few exalts, but it is well worth it. It improves your single target by ensuring the target will be hit by as many projectiles as possible, and it also gives you a huge boost to clear speed. In my testing, I've found that with the +2, you'll be beating Lightning Arrow for clear speed. It's what turns Tornado Shot into a top tier skill. As for the actual helmet, you'll have a fair bit of flexibility. Rat's Nest is probably the best in slot, while Devoto's Devotion is also really good, especially if you're doing Uber Lab farming. Both of these helmets add a lot of overall speed to the build. However, you can also just use a rare with life, resists, and some accuracy if possible. The most important thing is that you get those Tornado Shot secondary projectiles. The recommended body armor is Kintsugi. With the evasion and dodge we can get in this build, it is incredibly strong defensively and it suits this playstyle perfectly. You're only going to be getting hit every now and then, and that 20% mitigation is really good. It also is fantastic for Uber Lab running because it protects you from degens and traps. Until you get the money for a Kintsugi, they start at around 20C, you can just use a cheap evasion 5-link for a couple of chaos. For boots, I've just gone for some cheap rares with 30% move speed. You can also use Atziri's step for extra dodge, which would be pretty strong in hardcore. Ideal enchants on boots are move speed like mine or dodge. A fair bit of damage can be obtained on the glove slot with attack speed, accuracy, and phys damage. Here are mine, an okay pair. Alternatively, you can use Malagaras or Face Breakers for the crit multiplier. You could also use Shadows and Dust if you're looking to spend up a little bit. If you choose to use a unique pair of gloves, then you'll probably want to drop the unique from the head slot and instead just use a rare helmet. The best glove enchant, I think by far, is Spite, which shoots out chilled ground projectiles when you're hit, slowing enemies and giving you time to reposition and let Kintsugi reset. I have the Commandment of Spite enchant from Uber Lab and it is fantastic. For the amulet, I'm using Hinakora's Sight as it gives a huge amount of accuracy and dodge, a nice balance between offense and defense. Accuracy is an underrated stat for a lot of especially newer players. A lot of people don't realize that when you crit, it actually has to check your accuracy again a second time to ensure that the crit actually happens, so high accuracy in a high crit build is essential. Hinakora's, depending on the dodge rolls, ranges between like 10 to 20C at the moment, so it's quite affordable, especially considering what it actually gives you. Better still, however, would be an amulet with crit multi, accuracy, phys damage, and life and resist, but you're going to spend a lot to get something like that. You'll make up the bulk of your resists on your rings, but you can also get phys damage and crit. A rustic sash is ideal for this build because that damage scales your bleeds as well. You'll want to try and get a fair bit of life on these if possible as well. The only unique flask I recommend is Atziri's Promise. This adds chaos damage to your attacks, which increases the power of your poison, and it also gives you life leech. Flasks are otherwise standard with a basalt for additional physical mitigation. So with Tornado Shot, you'll be linked to physical projectile attack damage, PHYS, increased critical strikes, slower projectiles, and faster attacks. But Ziggy, they're all damage gems! And that's exactly right, and that's why this build is able to put out so much damage while despite, running Grace and Arctic Armor and not having any kind of extra elemental scaling like that. We just run all damage gems in this, and that's the beauty of Reach of the Council. Rather than using GMP here, we can use slower projectiles. Now, slower projectiles is not to everyone's taste. Some people don't like the way the projectiles move really slowly, but the negative impacts of that are really, really minor, and the more projectile damage is a major boost to both your bleed and poison damage as well as your initial hit. Now, if you really, really do not like using slower projectiles, you could use crit damage if you want instead. Now the next setup is your Curse on Hit setup, so this is using Ice Shot, and the reason for that is that Ice Shot chills targets when you hit them, as well as having a bit of extra AoE to it, so even when you hit an initial target, the Cone of Ice goes out and hits stuff behind it as well. So it does a great job at covering most of the screen with curses, and it chills everything, slowing them down, which is a really nice kind of defensive boost there. So we use Ice Shot, Curse on Hit with Vulnerability. Now if you can get a quality Vulnerability, that's very strong as well. And then you can use Chain, I recommend in the 4-link. You absolutely do not need a 5-link for this because I already had the 5-link Kintsugi and a 6-link my Reach of the Council. I just started using a 5-link. All you really need is a 4-link, Ice Shot, Curse on Hit, Vulnerability, and Chain, because you get the extra projectiles from Reach of the Council. If you're using something like Death's Opus or Linos, you can use GMP instead of Chain. Now if you're using a 4-link setup, like I recommend, then you can have another 2-link in here with something like Decoy Totem and something like Totem Survivability, so that will make things like Uber Lab a lot more easy to run. You don't really need to use Curse on Hit on most enemies, just fire your Ice Shot against nasty looking champ packs, rares, and bosses to give you that extra vulnerability damage. It's not needed for most trash mobs, just shoot them with Tornado Shot and they'll all die anyway. In the helmet, I use Blink Arrow linked to Culling Strike with Quality. This kind of gives you a little bit of attack speed, and it lets your Blink Arrow actually cull bosses, so you can use that on Izaro if you want. Alternatively, you can just use a faster attacks in here. I also use Enduring Cry for moments when I need a little bit of extra phys mitigation and regen, and then I have Purity of Elements in here to do elemental weakness maps if I'm not LE weakness capped. If you're LE weakness capped, as in you have 169% resistances standing in your hideout, then you won't need this. I just swap into this for those LE weakness maps in red maps. In the boots I use Blood Rage, Arctic Armor, an Ice Golem, and Grace. And then for my Castle and Damage Taken setup, I use a level 7 Castle and Damage Taken, with a level 9 Immortal Call and an increased duration which can be fully leveled. I also, in this setup, link Vile Haste so that it's also linked to the increased duration, and this is a nice boost for things like boss killing and sometimes also just getting through certain trap sections in the lab. For this build, the Bandits are going to be Life in Normal, Phys Damage in Cruel so that it scales your bleed and your initial hits, and then Power Charge in Merciless. That's so that you can gain the extra effects from Deadly Infusion, and I find 4 Power Charges to be pretty damn good with this. I sit around 80% crit chance with my Power Charges up. For traveling through the Ascendancy tree, in normal difficulty you want to take Noxus Strike. It's one of the biggest boosts for the build, so getting those chance to bleed and poison will be a huge boost, and around the time you swap to Phys with Death's Harp and Death's Opus, that'll start to kick in as well. And then you want to grab Toxic Delivery and Cruel, in Merciless Unstable Infusion to start getting those power charges, and then Deadly Infusion from the Uber Lab. For leveling and traveling through the passive tree, you want to head out Shadow, up this way, ignore Entropy until much later on, come down through this way, not a bad idea to grab Fangs of the Viper for leveling, go through the life nodes, get Piercing Shots, grab Acrobatics, come down this way and grab the life here, then head through this way, grab the life down here, grab King of the Hill. Around this point you'll be using Death's Harp and Death's Opus, and starting to get that crit chance will be very powerful. And you want to come across and get the life and Mana Lease just here, go down and grab Golem's Blood, go through Fury Bolts, and then grab the rest of the Duelist area. From there you're going to fill out things like Entropy, go under and grab Dirty Techniques, and fill out any missing nodes like Jewel Sockets once you get good jewels, grabbing Revenge of the Hunted for more life. Once you're starting to get into yellow tier maps, you'll probably want to go ahead and pick up Phase Acrobatics, as there are a lot of nasty spellcasters out, and that'll help your Kintsugi be much more powerful as well. For jewels, the core stats you're looking for are life and projectile damage, physical damage with bows, crit multiplier, attack speed with bows, damage over time. These are all really good as well. There's quite a lot of flexibility about which order you can take a lot of the little 2 and 3 pointer stuff in this build. Like you can grab Sniper at any point if you feel like you want to get that extra projectile damage. There's extra frenzy charges you can grab at any point you want. You can get more leech if you need it. You can get more crit and crit multi if you need it. So go with what you think's going to give you the biggest boost at the time, which is what I've done here. I mean, for example, jewels are pretty expensive, so if you can't afford a jewel like this, then just spending that 2 points on getting Sniper gives you 30% projectile damage anyway, which is really, really good. Now for leveling, I recommend you grab yourself a Storm Cloud and level Elemental at the beginning. This is probably the best way to level bows at the moment. Using Shrapnel Shot or Split Arrow with added Cold and added Lightning supports, you'll deal a ton of damage early on in Act 1. Then in Act 2, grab Herald of Thunder and Herald of Ice, and then later swap out Herald of Ice for the Wrath Aura. This will carry you all the way up until Death's Harp, and later into a Death's Opus when you can start swapping over to Phys. If you can get your hands on a Tabula Rasa for leveling with this build, you'll have crazy amounts of damage the entire way through, until endgame where you can swap over to a cheap 5-link evasion chest, while you save up for Kintsugi and Reach of the Council. Once you get set up with your Reach of the Council and Kintsugi and some of the other core items, I recommend taking this build and using it to farm the Uber Labyrinth to produce wealth. I'm rocking some pretty expensive gear on it now, like getting a 6-link and all that jazz, getting the +2 tornadoes, getting the +1 arrow drill neck, but I paid for all of that through Uber Lab farming. Selling enchants from fast and effective labyrinth runs on this build meant that each day I was getting a significant upgrade for the build and just kept getting better and better. This build scales excellently with investment. Once I got to that point where this build became really OP with the gear I have now, I've just been able to farm Labyrinth like crazy, and as well as doing any red tier maps I want, and I've been able to produce a ton of wealth with this as well. So this build's an excellent wealth builder for some of the really expensive builds in the game. I'm actually most of the way to my goal of 40 exalts to make a cast on crit discharge build next. But whatever you want to do with this build, maps, lab or Atziri, this build will excel at it. I haven't really found anything yet that it can't do. Well, except for Phys Reflect maps, but you can also actually run those. Just grab a Signal Fire Quiver and swap your crit gem to Phys to Lightning, and you'll be completely safe as you'll be dealing pure elemental damage. This isn't ideal, but it's good enough to run those elemental reflect maps that you occasionally will roll. I'm really, really happy with how this character turned out. I think it's my best yet. I know a lot of you guys are going to have a blast crushing bosses and maps with it. Feel free to leave any questions you have about the build in the comments below. That is it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.